Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. This is FPL Fran, and this is my transfer plan video for Gameweek 20 and beyond. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, obviously, is that I'm recording the video right before the Spurs games and the Arsenal games have been played. Of course, they will have an impact on my team. It might be the case that I actually end up with a red arrow. I think that's pretty unlikely unless Pedro Porro drops the performance of his life, very much like Solanke did versus Nottingham Forest. But as things stand, it actually seems like a very, very good game week. I am regretting actually a decision, definitely, to have played Colwell over Porro. And actually, the biggest regret really was that, Colwell had fitness issues recently and he didn't even make 60 minutes versus Crystal Palace. So for me, that was a bigger indictment on the decision. So I actually already regret it. I think that was a very bad move. So happy to hold my hands up. Ultimately, Romero is out. Christian Romero, that is, from Spurs. And the other big piece of news, obviously, is still the fixture on paper from a Spurs clean sheet point of view is very poor. So not expecting too much from Porro, but he very well could attack and do much better than Colwell. So we'll see how things go there. As far as the rest of my team, yeah, I'm very happy with the structure and in terms of the transfer that I made with Trent Alexander-Arnold. I talked about this last week as well when I was talking about my team selection, where I went for Trent and I sort of took that risk because I knew, first of all, the news about Haaland has never been good. We got news all week that he hasn't been in training, and he wasn't in training in Saudi Arabia either. So actually, when we sort of look at this week, the issue, I suppose, with people who've been holding Haaland is that you'll probably feel forced to hold Haaland, whereas for the people who aren't holding Haaland, in fact, you might actually consider making moves continuously, without Haaland in your team. And you don't necessarily need to plan for Haaland to stay in your team for the time being, just because if you miss, for example, such a good fixture like Gameweek 20 for Sheffield United at home, there's a justification to maybe continue to not own Haaland up until Gameweek 22. Unless, of course, there is an extreme circumstance where, let's say, double Gameweek 21 magically gets announced. Although I think the likelihood of that happening is pretty low as things stand. But from reading what Ben Crellin has mentioned, there is obviously still a plausible, and it has happened before, a possible option for double Gameweek 21. So we'll have to see what happens there, and that might change my plans. But I'm going to take into account, or at least I'm going to assume that double Gameweek 21 will not happen, and that my transfer plans will be based around that. So quickly talking about this week, when I look at my team, I think structurally speaking, it's in a good spot. The only issue, I suppose, is, first of all, I think in the future, one of my forwards definitely has to go towards Solanke. And part of that is because we know that there's going to be a Bournemouth double game week fixture. So as soon as Solanke's fixtures get a little bit easier, such as around game week 23, I think that's a great opportunity to sort of signpost that opportunity to move out of, let's say, Darwin or Alvarez, depending on how I, let's say, move into Haaland in the short term. And then the next move would really be to sort of, once again, maybe actually in the short term, actually go for a defender. Because right now, when I look at my team, Trent's great, Gabriel's great, Porro is great, who's on my bench. But Colwell, and to be honest, another player who's really annoyed me is Cash. So these players need to be adjusted in my team. And I still think the idea is to maybe keep Colwell, to be honest. Just because he's gotten a price rise, and I think right now there's an opportunity to maybe sell Cash before he potentially drops to 4.6. And also, there's a likelihood with both Cash and Porro, really, that they won't play the fixture in Game Week 20. So I think both of them are very, very valid transfers out. And ultimately, it's just a decision of, let's say, going past Game Week 20, do I think Cole can serve me on a fixture? Do I think Cash can serve me on a fixture? With Cole, I suppose you could say Chilwell could be back soon in January. With Cash, the issue, of course, is that they've been able to play plenty fine without him. That being Concert, right back at times, and other different structures that they can play. When I look at my team, though, another thing to sort of think about is, what to do with Salah and what to do with Son. Initially, I think I was probably going to sell both Salah and Son, but I think there are some transfer options as well where maybe I just keep Salah for the time being. Because, yes, I can go into Haaland, but I can also play a 3-4-3 for multiple weeks. And the way I see myself doing that is by keeping Salah potentially in my team, dropping Son into someone like Olise or Eze or Douglas Luiz, and moving on Alvarez or Darwin into Haaland in the future. So that could be one option where I play a 3-4-3 with those sort of 7 out of 8 players, with Salah blanking for a few weeks, hoping that he comes back a little bit sooner than expected. And he could do quite well for me in terms of FPL. The alternative option, obviously, is on successive weeks, such as Game Week 21, Game Week 22, so on and so forth, I make moves away from Son and Salah. And so a lot of people will be asking also, who are the best replacements for Son? Who are the best replacements for Salah? In terms of probably, how you can actually stretch your budget, I do think options like Odegaard, Bruno, and Bowen are up there. Now, Bruno, obviously, you might be dismayed at all his performances and United in general. With Odegaard, you're also looking at a very crazy player, very different to Bowen, for example, who's almost purely a goal threat. Odegaard, of course, is very creative, can get access to bonus points, is on a few set pieces, and potentially is on penalties at times. So I think it does depend on how you evaluate those picks, but I think one of the three could serve you well. And if you do, for example, similarly to me, want to actually, let's say, keep maybe Salah on your team and you don't really have any plans of taking both Son and Salah out, there are other options like Douglas Luiz, which would easily allow you to, let's say, hoard, for example, Salah or Son over this period, one of the two of them at least, and then actually going to Haaland. Keeping both of them, in my opinion, is not really an option for most of us managers. I don't think we have, first of all, a competent enough four-back structure that we can actually utilize, permanently at least, to sort of benefit, I suppose, in the meantime, from actually keeping Son and Salah. And so it just makes sense when Haaland is back on Gameweek 21 or Gameweek 22 to make a double free transfer there and just go into Haaland then. So those are my transfer plans roughly. I would say I'm probably going to make a defensive transfer actually instead on Gameweek 20. Try and, for example, get a Man City defender who has pretty good clean sheet odds. Although I recognize, of course, they haven't been able to get clean sheets as of late. I just think, obviously, when we talk about fixtures like Everton away compared to Sheffield United at home, there is a gulf. And so I'm happy, for example, for this week specifically, to go into a City defender. And then going forwards, we can obviously, as I said, plan towards Haaland with 2 free transfers in Game Week 22 and make the move there where we move away from Son or Salah instead. And so those are my immediate thoughts in terms of how I address my team. I also think that there's an option where maybe I roll. Maybe I actually can play, when I look at next week, for example, I can actually play certain players like a Gabriel here instead and actually completely forget about Walker. Because with Gabriel, Porro, Trent, I still think that's a very competent defense. With Cash and Colwell, I just think the minutes are very uncertain for both players. And it's not really worth thinking about starting them. Maybe Cash would make sense. It is Burnley at home. He is an attacking fullback at times. And that might justify, a start over Gabriel compared to, let's say, Colwell, who honestly has been extremely dismaying for me. And also his minutes, I think, have really been poor. As far as the midfield, Saka, Richarlison, Son, Salah, I don't see myself moving away from that. I think my captaincy will actually be on Alvarez. You're looking at, once again, another week where he's the pen taker, he's the set piece taker, and still playing as a forward. Now, of course, when you watch, for example, Alvarez play, he's not like Erling Haaland. I don't think he's like an out-and-out striker per se. He does drop into the midfield at times. He does cover in gaps. He does, for example, move into almost a right-wing position to defend. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Alvarez isn't getting good opportunities. I think even when you take away the penalty, his expected goal involvement for the Everton game is a good example. And even in the last 2 games, we've seen an uptick from Alvarez's underlying stats. And that's a really good positive. And also suggests that ultimately, whatever you think of sometimes the way he drops back into the midfield, he is still getting into better positions than, let's say, when Erling was within the team, within a small sample size. And that's something to think about. But yeah, ultimately, this is the easiest fixture in the league. I know some players have blanked recently in Sheffield United at home, but you can look at Palmer as a good example of what you can do with a player who is on penalties versus Sheffield United at home. And of course, Palmer didn't even get a penalty. He just simply got 1 goal, 1 assist, because that's the sort of quality of Sheffield United as a team, unfortunately. So looking into that situation, I think the other thing to talk about is that I do have a benching dilemma, and that's between Darwin and Palmer. Personally, I think what I'll actually do is probably play Palmer over Darwin. And so I'm just going to sort of lock that move in for now and let my mind sort of sit on that as the week goes by. The big thing about why I'm actually going for Palmer is because coming off of a suspension, I think there's an absolute guarantee that he should be playing 90 minutes because he's basically been rested in the midweek fixture. And as you know, midweek rotation, midweek rest is very possible. Not to mention that Jota's back as well for this Liverpool team. There is a chance, for example, that Darwin can get subbed off quite early, which is possible. When you look at, for example, the early substitutions within the Liverpool game itself, Luis Diaz came on quite early, and some players were hooked off at 67 minutes. It's very possible that someone like Darwin could also be prone to an early substitution. So I think it's not really worth gambling Darwin here, particularly when I have such great fixtures in Watkins and Alvarez, which means that I can easily play a 3-5-2 like this. And ultimately, with everyone else, I suppose the only concern within my midfield is going to be Richarlison, where, we need to sort of assess how he's doing with that back issue. But that fixture, Bournemouth at home, I still think is very, very good, even though Romero's out. So, in my opinion, it's still a Darwin bench for me, and I'll sort of have to just assess, as I said, between Palmer, between Richarlison and Darwin, if anything sort of comes up. As far as the goalkeeper situation, I think it's very clearly an Areola one. Complete gulf in opponents, really, even though Newcastle, I still hold in higher regard than West Ham. As far as the defense, as I said, it's a case of maybe Gabriel and Cash, but I think also when I have such a solid option like Gabriel, it just makes sense to play him and not take the risk with someone like Cash in a week where I don't have to take that risk per se. And so that's why I'm sort of tempted to go Gabriel. But at the same time, I was also saying that I could go Walker so that I can bench Gabriel, and we'll see how that goes. But those are my transfer plans so far. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of the coming game weeks. Personally, I think this is going to be an interesting landscape where we're still waiting for more news in terms of any more additional information we can get in terms of the FA Cup games in the future, double game weeks and things like that, before we actually set in stone, for example, chip strategies for the back half of the season. But in terms of immediate transfers, I do think it's worth thinking about when is the best time to go into Haaland. Personally, I think it's worth actually delaying until Game Week 22 now that we've gotten the news from Pep that we won't really see him in 2023. Not to mention as well, particularly if you're, let's say, owning someone like Alvarez, that his minutes could easily dwindle very, very quickly in 2024, which means that when KDB comes back, it's very likely, in my opinion, that Foden will probably keep his spot in the team, and Alvarez is less likely to do so if Haaland is back in the team. So those are my thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope you guys have some lovely green arrows and have some happy times ahead.